the cake. It's amazing.
Can I blow out the candles now, please?
I had everything money could buy, and not a single person who remembered I existed. The city stretched beneath my penthouse windows, 12 million people moving through the night like veins of light, headlights crawling across wet asphalt, horns echoing faintly 30 floors below, and somewhere out there, life was happening without me while inside. Everything stood perfectly still. The chandelier above the dining table cast a golden glow over a cake no one had touched. 5 tiers, imported chocolate, gold leaf edges. My name written in careful icing that looked too perfect to be real. Adrian Volkov, as if saying it beautifully could make it matter. It didn't. The candles had burned halfway down already, thin trails of smoke curling into the quiet air, and I realized I hadn't even made a wish. I didn't know what I would wish for. My phone buzzed against the marble counter, another message lighting up the screen, another happy birthday from someone who needed something. Investors, partners, men who smiled too easily and meant none of it, their words polished, empty, transactional. I muted it without reading. The silence that followed was louder than anything. I leaned back in the chair, the leather cool against my shoulders, and let my eyes drift across the room. The skyline, the expensive art I never looked at, the life I had built piece by piece until there was nothing left to add. No laughter, no voices, just quiet, just control, just me. I reached for the glass beside the cake. The ice melted, the drink watered down, and paused halfway. My reflection caught faintly in the window, sharp suit, steady eyes, a man who owned half the city and somehow had nowhere to go tonight. That was when the elevator chimed. Soft, polite, out of place. I frowned, setting the glass down slowly, my mind already running through possibilities, none of them expected, none of them welcome. I hadn't scheduled anything. No meetings. No guests. No one came here without permission. Footsteps followed, hesitant, lighter than I was used to, not the confident stride of men in tailored suits, but something uneven, uncertain, and then a voice, quiet, apologetic, just beyond the doorway. I'm sorry. I think I have the wrong address. I stood before I realized I was moving, instinct pulling me toward the sound, toward something unfamiliar in a place that had long stopped surprising me. And when I reached the entrance, I saw her. She stood there like she didn't belong in my world, worn denim jacket, hair pulled back in a loose tie, a bakery box held carefully in her hands like it mattered, like it was important, and beside her, a small boy peeked around her leg, his wide eyes scanning everything with the kind of curiosity I hadn't seen in years. They both froze when they saw me, the silence stretching between us, and for a moment, I saw it clearly, the difference, the distance, the life I had built versus the one they carried with them. Simple, imperfect, real. This is 40th floor, right? She asked, glancing down at the receipt, her voice steady but unsure, and I nodded once, slower than usual, my gaze shifting to the box in her hands, to the faint scent of sugar and butter that suddenly felt warmer than anything in the room. Yeah, I said, my voice quieter than I expected. It is. The boy stepped forward then, just a little, tugging gently at her sleeve before looking up at me, fearless in a way adults never were, and asked, Hey, mister, did you already blow out your candles? The question landed somewhere I wasn't prepared for, simple, innocent, impossible to ignore, and for the first time that night, I hesitated. I looked back at the untouched cake behind me, the dimming candles, the empty room, and then back at him, at the way he waited like the answer actually mattered, and something inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time, shifted. No, I said slowly, the word unfamiliar on my tongue. I didn't. And somehow, that felt like the beginning of something I couldn't control. The boy did not wait for permission. He stepped past me like the space already belonged to him, small sneakers tapping softly against polished marble as his eyes locked onto the cake, and I found myself moving aside without thinking, without calculating, without control, something I had not done in years, while Clara hesitated at the doorway, her fingers tightening slightly around the bakery box as if she was ready to apologize again, to retreat, to disappear from a place that was never meant for someone like her. But I spoke before she could. It is fine. The words came out steady, quieter than usual, and she looked up at me like she was trying to understand what kind of man would say that in a place like this. "We really did not mean to interrupt," she said, her voice careful, respectful, but not afraid, and that alone caught my attention. More than anything else had tonight, because people were always one of two things around me, eager or terrified, never normal, and she was normal in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost disarming. "Mom, look," the boy said, already standing in front of the table, staring at the candles like they were the most important thing in the world. "He did not even blow them out yet," he added, turning back to me with a seriousness that made it impossible not to respond, and I exhaled slowly, my gaze shifting from him to the cake and back again. "I guess I was waiting," I said, though I had not realized it until that moment, and something in Clara's expression softened, just slightly, like she understood more than I had said. "Ethan," she said gently, stepping closer, "we should not stay." But he shook his head immediately, stubborn in the way only children could be. "No, he needs help," he insisted, then looked at me again, tilting his head, studying me like I was not a man people avoided, but just a person. "You have to make a wish first," he explained, as if it was obvious, as if I should have known, and I almost smiled, the feeling unfamiliar, restrained. "But there, I do not usually do that," I admitted, my voice low, honest in a way I had not been with anyone in a long time, and he frowned, not impressed. "That is why you look sad," he said simply, and the words landed harder than anything anyone had said to me in years, because they were not calculated, not careful, just true, and I felt something tighten in my chest, something I had ignored for too long. Clara glanced at me quickly, like she was about to correct him, apologize for him, but I shook my head once, stopping her, because for some reason, I did not want that moment softened. "Okay," I said instead, stepping closer to the table, the faint warmth of the candles brushing against my skin. "What do I wish for?" I asked, more to him than to myself, and Ethan grinned, like this was the easiest question in the world. "Something you do not already have," he said, and I let out a quiet breath, my eyes lowering to the flickering flames, the reflection dancing in the glossy surface of the cake. And for the first time that night, I closed my eyes, not to think, not to calculate, just to feel, the silence around me shifting, no longer empty, but waiting. And in that brief moment, I realized there was something I did not have, something no amount of money or power had ever given me, something standing right in front of me now in worn shoes and a quiet voice and a child who was not afraid to tell the truth. And when I opened my eyes again, the city outside still stretched endlessly, but it no longer felt as distant as it had a few minutes ago. "Now blow them out," Ethan whispered, like it mattered, like it was important, and for the first time in years, I did exactly what I was told. The candles went out in a single breath, thin trails of smoke rising into the air like something invisible finally being released, and for a second, no one spoke. Not me, not Clara, not even Ethan, as if the moment itself needed time to settle, to become real, and I stood there looking at the darkened wicks, realizing I could not remember the last time something so small had felt significant. "See," Ethan said proudly, breaking the silence first. "That was not so hard," and I let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, low and unfamiliar, my hand resting lightly against the edge of the table as I glanced at him. "You make it sound easy," I replied, and he shrugged like it was obvious, like life was supposed to be simple, like people were supposed to show up, and something in that simplicity stayed with me longer than it should have. Clara shifted her weight slightly beside him, her eyes moving from me to the cake and back again, as if she was trying to decide whether to stay or leave, caught between politeness and something she could not quite name. "We should really go," she said softly, but there was hesitation in her voice now, less urgency than before, and I found myself reacting before I thought it through. "Stay," I said, the word quiet but firm, enough to make her pause completely, her eyes meeting mine in a way that felt direct, unguarded. "It is a large cake," I added after a second, a subtle attempt to make the moment feel normal, less like an invitation and more like a reason, and Ethan did not wait for her answer. "Yes," he said immediately, climbing onto one of the chairs with careful determination, already reaching for a fork like he had been here 100 times before, and Clara let out a small breath, something between a sigh and a laugh, shaking her head slightly, as if she had lost an argument she had not even meant to have. "Just one slice," she said, more to herself than to me, and I nodded once, moving toward the cabinet without hesitation, retrieving plates that had never been used for anything real before, just formal dinners and empty gestures. But tonight felt different, quieter, warmer, the sound of the fork against porcelain filling the space where silence used to sit too comfortably. I cut the cake slowly, the knife gliding through layers that looked too perfect to eat, but Ethan leaned forward, watching like it mattered, like every movement had weight, and when I handed him the first slice, his eyes lit up in a way I had not seen directed at me in. I could not remember how long. "Thank you," he said, genuine, immediate, and I realized how rare that word had become in my world, how often it was said without meaning anything at all. Clara accepted her plate more carefully, her fingers brushing against mine for a brief second, not intentional, not calculated, just human, and she looked at me like she wanted to say something but decided against it, choosing instead to sit across from me, her posture relaxed but aware, still trying to understand the space she had stepped into. "You live here alone," she said after a moment. Not a question, more like an observation, and I nodded once, my gaze drifting briefly toward the windows, toward the city that never stopped moving. "Yes," I answered, and for once, I did not add anything to it, did not explain, did not justify, just let the word exist as it was, and Ethan spoke again before the silence could grow too heavy. "That is why you needed a birthday," he said between bites, completely certain, and I looked at him, then at Clara, who seemed equally unsure whether to correct him or agree, and something shifted again, something small but undeniable, like the space around me was no longer empty, like for the first time in a long time, I was not just existing inside it, but actually part of it. The room felt different after that, not quieter, not louder, just fuller, like something invisible had shifted into place, and I noticed it in the smallest details. The way Ethan's laughter echoed lightly against the high ceilings, the way Clara relaxed inch by inch without realizing it, her shoulders no longer tense, her hands no longer gripping the edge of the plate like she was ready to leave at any moment. And I found myself watching them more than I should have, not out of suspicion, not out of habit, but because there was something there I did not understand yet, something unfamiliar and strangely steady. "This is really good," Ethan said, pointing his fork at the cake like it deserved recognition, and I nodded once, though I had not even taken a bite. "It should be," I replied, almost automatically. "It cost more than most people spend in a month." And the words hung there for a second, sharper than I intended, but Clara did not react the way others would have. She did not look impressed, did not look uncomfortable. She just tilted her head slightly and said, "That does not always mean it tastes better." Simple, direct, and for some reason, that stayed with me longer than it should have. I picked up my fork then, cutting a small piece, tasting it for the first time, and realized she was right. It was good, but not special, not the way this moment somehow was. "So what do you do?" she asked after a moment, her voice careful but curious, and I paused. The question, so ordinary it almost felt foreign. People usually knew who I was before they spoke to me. They adjusted their words, their tone, their expectations, but she did not. She was asking because she wanted to know, not because she already did. "I run businesses," I said finally, keeping it simple, and she nodded like that was enough, like she did not need more, which was new, which was easier. "That sounds busy," she said, and I let out a quiet breath. "It is," I admitted, though that was not the full truth. Busy was not the same as meaningful, but I did not say that out loud. Ethan leaned forward again, his attention shifting quickly like children always did. "Do you have any friends here?" he asked, looking around the large space as if expecting people to appear, and I hesitated, just for a second, before answering. "No." The word came out more honest than I expected, and Clara's eyes flickered slightly at that. Not pity, not judgment, just understanding, and that was somehow worse, or maybe better. I had not decided yet. "Well," Ethan said, as if solving a problem, "now you do." And he smiled, wide and certain, like it was already decided, like it did not need permission, and something in my chest tightened again, not painful, just unfamiliar, Like a muscle I had not used in years was waking up slowly. Clara glanced at him, then at me, a small, almost apologetic smile touching her lips. He says things like that, she said softly, and I shook my head once, my gaze still on the boy. He should not stop, I replied, and I meant it, more than I expected to, because for the first time in a long time, someone had said something to me without weighing it, without calculating what it might cost or gain, just said it because it felt true. And as the city lights flickered beyond the glass and the night stretched on, I realized I was not checking my phone anymore, not thinking about meetings or deals or anything waiting for me tomorrow. I was just here, sitting at a table that no longer felt too big, in a space that no longer felt empty. And when Clara finally stood, brushing her hands lightly against her jeans, glancing toward the door like she knew it was time, I felt it. Immediately, that quiet shift again, like something was about to leave before I was ready for it. "We should go," she said, her voice gentle but firm this time, and I stood too, without thinking, without planning, just following the moment. "I will walk you out," I said, and as we moved toward the elevator together, Ethan reaching for my hand without hesitation, like it was the most natural thing in the world, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else had tonight. I did not want this to be the last time I saw them. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime that felt louder than it should have, sealing in a silence that was no longer empty, but heavy, like something unspoken lingered between us, and I stood there beside them, aware of every small detail in a way I had not been in years, the faint scent of vanilla from the bakery box, the quiet hum of the cables above us, the way Ethan's hand fits so easily into mine as if it had always belonged there. And I did not pull away, did not correct it, just let it happen, because for once, I did not feel the need to control everything. "You do not have to come all the way down," Clara said gently, her eyes flicking toward the floor numbers lighting up one by one. But I shook my head once, my gaze steady. "I do," I replied, though I could not explain why, not in a way that made sense, not in a way that would sound reasonable, but it felt necessary. Like letting them leave without me would make this entire night feel less real, less important. The elevator slowed, the doors opening into the quiet lobby where polished stone reflected the soft overhead lights. Everything immaculate, everything distant again, and yet it did not feel the same as before, not entirely. Ethan stepped forward first, still holding my hand until the very last second, then letting go only when he reached for his mother. "Thank you for the cake," he said, looking up at me with that same open expression, like gratitude was simple, like it did not need to be earned through anything complicated, and I nodded once, the words settling somewhere deeper than they should have. "Thank you for the wish," I answered, and he smiled. Like that was enough, like the exchange was fair, complete. Clara adjusted her jacket slightly, her fingers brushing against the strap of her bag, a small, nervous habit she seemed unaware of, and for a moment, she just looked at me, like she was trying to memorize something, or maybe understand it. "You did not have to let us stay," she said quietly. "Most people would not have," and I held her gaze steady, unguarded in a way I rarely allowed. "Most people are not you," I replied, the words leaving before I could filter them, and something shifted in her expression, subtle but real, like the distance between us had shortened just enough to notice, a faint crease of uncertainty, maybe curiosity. "Still," she said after a second, "it meant something." And I felt that again, that unfamiliar pull in my chest, stronger this time, less ignorable, like a quiet truth settling into place, and I realized she was right. It had meant something, more than the calls, the messages, the expensive gestures that filled my life without ever touching it. This had reached me in a way nothing else had. The glass doors at the entrance slid open as a cool night breeze drifted inside, carrying the distant sound of traffic, the city alive and indifferent as always, and Clara stepped forward, Ethan already tugging gently at her hand, ready to move on, to continue a life that existed far outside of mine, and I felt it again, sharper this time, that sense of something slipping away before I had figured out how to hold on to it. "Clara," I said, stopping her just as she reached the threshold, and she turned back, surprised that I knew her name, her brows lifting slightly. "You said that earlier," I added, a quiet explanation, though I had not needed one. I remembered it because I wanted to, because it mattered. Yes, she said slowly, still watching me, waiting, and for a moment, I did not know what I was going to say. Not because I lacked words, but because I was not used to needing the right ones, not like this. Not when the outcome mattered in a way that had nothing to do with business or control. Will I see you again? I asked finally, the question simple, direct, but carrying more weight than it should have. And the silence that followed stretched just long enough to make me aware of how rare it was for me to ask anything without already knowing the answer. Clara glanced down at Ethan, then back at me, her expression soft but thoughtful, like she was considering something real, something that could change more than just a moment. Maybe, she said, and it was not a promise, not a refusal, just possibility. And as she turned and stepped out into the night, her hand firmly in Ethan's, I stood there in the doorway, watching them disappear into a world I did not belong to. And for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly what I wanted my next wish to be. The lobby felt colder after they left, not because the temperature had changed, but because something warm had gone with them. And I stood there longer than I should have, my eyes fixed on the glass doors even after they disappeared into the night, as if waiting would bring them back, as if this was something I could control if I just stayed still long enough. But it was not, and I knew that, which made it worse in a way I was not used to. I finally turned, the quiet of the building settling back around me, familiar, precise, empty again, but not entirely the same, because now I could feel the difference. Now I could recognize what was missing. The elevator ride back up felt longer, slower, each floor lighting up one by one as if giving me too much time to think, and I did not like that. I was not someone who sat with thoughts that did not have solutions, but tonight had not followed any rules I understood. The doors opened to the penthouse and I stepped inside, the city still, stretched wide beyond the windows, the same lights, the same endless motion, but the room itself felt paused, like it had been waiting for something that had already passed. The cake still sat on the table, a few slices missing now, plates left behind in a way that would have annoyed me any other night. But I did not call anyone to clean it, did not fix it. I just stood there, taking in the evidence that someone had been here, that it had not been imagined, that for a brief moment, this place had been something else entirely. I walked slowly toward the table, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge where Ethan had sat, where he had laughed without hesitation, where Clara had looked at me like I was not someone to be feared or impressed by, just someone, and that thought stayed with me longer than anything else. I reached for my phone out of habit, the screen lighting up instantly with missed calls, messages, names that carried weight and expectation, and for the first time, I did not feel the usual pull to respond. I turned it off instead, placing it face down on the counter, choosing silence over noise, choosing this, whatever this was becoming. I moved toward the window, looking out over the city again, but this time my reflection caught my attention more than the skyline did, and I saw it clearly. The difference, subtle but there, something less rigid in my expression, something unsettled, but not in a way that felt threatening. More like something had shifted out of place and was trying to find where it belonged again. I exhaled slowly, my breath faint against the glass, and for a moment, I let myself consider something I had avoided my entire life. That maybe control was not the only thing that mattered. That maybe there were things worth not controlling, worth waiting for, worth wanting, and Clara's voice echoed faintly in my mind. Quiet but certain, it meant something, she had said, and I understood now that she was right, more right than she realized, because it had changed something I could not ignore, something I did not want to lose. I turned away from the window, my steps steady again, more focused now, not on business, not on numbers, but on something far less predictable. I needed to see them again, not by accident, not by chance, but because I chose it, because for the first time in a long time, there was something in my life that was not replaceable, not negotiable, not part of a deal. I moved toward my desk, pulling open a drawer I rarely used, retrieving a simple notepad, writing down the one detail I had. The bakery name printed faintly on the box Clara had carried, the only thread I had to follow. And as I set the pen down, I felt something unfamiliar settle into place, not control, not certainty, but intention, and for once, that was enough to move forward. The next morning did not feel like any morning I had lived before. the light cutting through the floor to ceiling windows softer somehow, less intrusive, as if the city itself had decided to be quieter, and I stood there for a moment longer than usual, not reaching for my phone, not checking the time, just standing, letting the stillness settle in a way that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. And then my eyes drifted to the table, to the half-eaten cake still sitting there, to the plates left, exactly where they had been. And for once, I did not call anyone to clear it away. I left it because it was proof that last night had happened, that it had not been another empty evening dressed up to look like something more. I moved toward it slowly, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge again, the memory of Ethan's voice still lingering in the air, and I realized something simple but undeniable. I wanted to hear it again. I wanted to see them again, not as a passing moment, not as an accident, but as something I chose, something I pursued, and that thought alone shifted something deeper inside me, something that had nothing to do with business or control. I reached for the notepad where I had written the bakery name, the ink still fresh, the letters uneven in a way that felt almost out of place in my world of precision, and I picked it up, reading it again, memorizing it as if it mattered, because it did. More than anything scheduled on my calendar today, I dressed without thinking, the routine automatic, the suit tailored, the details exact, but there was something different beneath it, something less rigid, less mechanical, and when I stepped into the elevator, I did not feel like I was descending into another day of transactions. I felt like I was moving towards something unknown, something I did not fully understand yet. The city greeted me with its usual noise, taxis passing, people moving quickly with purpose, the smell of coffee drifting through the air from nearby shops, and for the first time in a long time, I noticed it, really noticed it, the life happening around me instead of just above it. The bakery was not hard to find, a small place on a quieter street, the kind of place I would have ignored before, but now it stood out, not because of how it looked, but because of what it represented. I paused outside for a second, watching through the glass, the warm light inside, the display of pastries arranged carefully, imperfect in a way that felt real. And then I stepped in, the bell above the door chiming softly, the scent of sugar and fresh bread immediately surrounding me, grounding in a way I did not expect. A woman behind the counter looked up, offering a polite smile that shifted slightly when she took in my appearance, the suit, the posture, the way I carried myself. "Can I help you?" she asked, and I nodded once, my gaze scanning the space, searching for something familiar, something that told me I was in the right place. "I am looking for Clara Hayes," I said, keeping my voice even, controlled, though there was something beneath it I could not quite suppress, something closer to anticipation than anything I was used to. The woman hesitated for just a second, then glanced toward the back. "She is not on shift yet," she replied, and I felt that small shift again, that quiet disappointment I had not prepared for, but I nodded, accepting it without showing it. "When will she be?" I asked, and she checked the clock on the wall. "About an hour," she said, and I considered leaving, returning later, continuing my day as planned, but instead, I did something I had not done in years, something simple, almost insignificant. "I will wait," I said, and I moved toward one of the small tables by the window, sitting down in a space that was not mine, not controlled, not expected, and as I sat there, watching the door, listening to the quiet rhythm of the place, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else. So far, I was no longer just passing time. I was choosing where to spend it, and for the first time, that choice felt like it actually mattered. The bell above the door chimed again about 40 minutes later, soft but sharp enough to pull my attention from the window, and I did not need to look up immediately to know it was her. Something in the rhythm of that moment felt familiar, like recognition before confirmation, and when I finally turned, there she was, stepping inside with that same quiet presence, her hair slightly out of place from the wind, a canvas bag over her shoulder, and Ethan beside her, holding her hand loosely as he looked around with the same open curiosity as before, and for a second, she did not see me. She moved behind the counter, greeting her coworker, tying her apron, settling into a routine that looked simple but steady, and I watched it longer than I should have, noticing the way she moved, efficient but gentle, how she spoke to customers with a kind of attention that did not feel forced, and I realized something I had not considered before. This was her world, small, grounded, real, and I was sitting inside it like I did not quite belong. The thought should have made me uncomfortable, but it did not. Not the way it used to, because for once, I was not trying to own the space. I was just in it. Mom, Ethan said suddenly, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. He is here. And Clara turned instinctively, her eyes following his line of sight until they landed on me. And I saw the exact moment recognition settled in, surprise first, then something softer, something unreadable but not unwelcome. You waited, she said as she walked over, her tone not accusing, just noticing, and I stood, not out of habit, but because it felt right. I said I would see you again, I replied, though that had not been exactly what I said, but it felt close enough, and she gave a small breath of a laugh, shaking her head slightly like she did not expect this, like she was trying to decide what it meant. Most people do not follow through like that, she said, and I held her gaze. Steady. I am not most people, I answered, and this time the words did not carry weight or warning, just truth, simple and direct. Ethan stepped closer to the table, already comfortable, already acting like this was a continuation of something that had not really ended. Did you make another wish? He asked, and I almost smiled again, the feeling easier this time, less foreign. Not yet, I said. I think I am still figuring it out. And he nodded like that made sense, like not knowing was part of the process, something I had never allowed myself before. Clara glanced toward the counter, then back at me, a small crease forming between her brows. I have to work, she said, a quiet reminder of reality, of boundaries, and I nodded once, understanding. Without resistance. Then I will stay, I said, taking a seat again without hesitation, and she paused for a second, studying me like she was trying to understand why, trying to measure intention in a way that did not come with fear, just caution. You do not have to, she replied, and I shook my head slightly. I know, I said, and that was the difference. I was not here because I had to be. I was here because I chose to be. And something in her expression shifted again, subtle but real, like she was starting to believe that, or at least consider it. She returned to the counter then, moving back into her routine, but this time, there was an awareness between us, a quiet thread that had not been there before, and I stayed where I was, watching the small details again, the way Ethan sat across from me, swinging his legs slightly, the way Clara glanced over every so often without realizing it. And for the first time in a long time, I was not thinking about what came next. I was not planning, not calculating. I was just present. And as the minutes passed, turning into something that felt less like waiting and more like belonging, I understood something that would have seemed impossible just a day ago. This was not a distraction. This was not temporary. This was something I wanted to build, slowly, carefully, not by force, not by control, but by staying, by showing up, by choosing it again and again until it became something real. Time did not rush after that. It unfolded, slowly, quietly, like something that did not need to prove itself. And I stayed in that small bakery longer than I had planned, longer than any part of my life would have allowed before, watching Clara move between customers with steady focus, listening to the soft rhythm of conversation and the occasional sound of the bell above the door, and somehow, none of it felt like a waste of time. None of it felt beneath me. It felt necessary. Ethan had eventually grown restless, sliding off his chair and wandering closer to the counter. Asking questions Clara answered without missing a beat, her voice patient, warm, and I found myself memorizing that tone, the way it carried something real, something that did not exist in the world I came from. When the morning rush slowed, she finally stepped away, wiping her hands lightly on her apron before walking over, her movements a little more relaxed now, a little less guarded. You are still here, she said, not surprised this time, just acknowledging it. And I nodded once, leaning back slightly in the chair. I said I would stay, I replied, and she studied me for a second, like she was trying to understand what that meant beyond the words. People usually leave when they get bored, she said, and I shook my head slightly. I am not bored, I answered, and that was the truth, simple and unfamiliar. She glanced toward Ethan, who was now tracing shapes on the fogged glass of the front window, completely content, and something softened in her expression again, something quieter, less cautious than before. He likes you, she said, almost like a warning, and I followed her gaze, watching the boy for a moment before responding. I like him too. And the words felt natural, unforced, like they belonged, like they had been waiting to be said. Clara let out a small breath, something between relief and uncertainty, and sat across from me this time, not as a customer, not as a stranger, but as someone willing to stay a little longer. You are not what I expected, she admitted, and I raised an eyebrow slightly. And what did you expect? I asked, genuinely curious, and she hesitated, searching for the right words. Someone who would not notice things like this, she said finally, gesturing lightly to the bakery, the simple space, the details that most people overlooked, and I nodded slowly, understanding more than she realized. I did. Not, I admitted, not before, and her eyes met mine again, a quiet question forming without being spoken, and I held her gaze, letting the truth sit there between us without dressing it up, without hiding it behind anything else. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was steady, like both of us were adjusting to something new at the same time. Ethan ran back over then, his energy unchanged, his presence grounding in a way I had not expected. Mom, can we come back tomorrow? He asked, and she smiled faintly, brushing a hand through his hair. We come here every day, she said, and he shook his head, pointing at me. No, I mean with him. And the question hung there, simple but heavier than it should have been, and for a moment, neither of us answered, because it was not just about tomorrow. It was about what came after, about whether this was a moment or something more, and I felt it clearly then. That choice again, the same one I had made when I walked into this place, when I decided to stay, when I chose not to leave things to chance. I leaned forward slightly, my voice steady but quieter than usual. If that is okay, I said, not to Ethan, but to Clara, because this was not something I could take, not something I could control. It had to be given, and she looked at me for a long second, really looked, like she was measuring something deeper than words, something that did not come with guarantees, just intention, and then she nodded, small but certain. Okay, she said, and that single word settled into place like something permanent, something real. And as the day moved forward, as the city continued without noticing the shift that had just happened, I sat there with them, not as a man who owned everything, but as someone who had finally found something he did not want to lose, and for the first time, that was enough, more than enough, to make me stay.